Everyone. Good evening. We are at different time zones. I'm Visera Pancheva. I'm a professor of art history at Stanford University, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this event. I would like to thank the Stanford side. This is Nora Khaled, Jovana Knežević, and Pavle Levy, the um, chair of the art history department. And now I would like very briefly to turn to my co-organizer, Professor Nicola Zuthor from Yale.
Yes, hello everyone, and I would like to thank the Russian and East European Study program at Yale for having sponsored the event today, and especially Christina Andriotis and Molly Bronson, and the introduction today. So this is the second part of the webinar. First part was on April 1st, and we had Sergei Loznitsa speaking on his really moving film Maidan, Uprising in Ukraine, and today Visera Pancheva will introduce into the event.
Thank you, Nicola. And I also want to name the program that sponsored the events on the Stanford side, the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies. So I now move to the introduction. Thank you all for coming. The plan is we have 3 magnificent speakers, very short responses from 2 of the graduate students, one at Stanford, one at Yale, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Cultural rights are a necessity, not a luxury, and have inherent importance to human dignity, states Karima Benoun, a law professor at UC Davis and United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. She continues, and I quote, "Cultural rights include the right to take part in cultural life without discrimination, to access and enjoy cultural heritage, to have artistic and scientific freedom, and to benefit from the progress conceived through these endeavors. Artistic expressions have a strong transformative power and can influence society. Humanity reimagines and restores itself through the revising of its cultural life. Cultural rights defenders and artists are at the forefront of resisting oppression and upholding human rights." End of quote. I bring to your attention the legal language of international law as to what constitutes cultural rights, because a new page of awareness has opened linking directly cultural heritage with human rights. This is especially important for cases of armed conflict, be it Yemen or Syria or now Ukraine. As we have seen from the now 8 weeks of continuing war in Ukraine, there is an indiscriminate bombing of hospitals, schools, theaters, apartment complexes. Bodies and buildings are linked. Cultural memory adheres to sites, to buildings. Part of the corrosive politics of Putin's Russia is to wipe out not only the infrastructure, but the sites of memory, decimating cities and their inhabitants. Today's session has a modest goal: to look through a longue durée of Ukrainian art and uncover those special moments in which Ukrainian identity was constructed and negotiated through the artistic production, be it the architecture and decoration of churches, or 20th century avant-gardes, or recently, installation and performance art. Our previous session was a discussion with the film director Sergei Loznitsa and his film Maidan, which captures and responds to the 2014 demonstration and regime change in Ukraine. That conversation, led by Srejan Kecha, a colleague of mine at Stanford, touched upon the sense of solidarity, shared goal transforming every scene into a harmoniously composed image, the treatment of people as collective body of resistance, or the role of sound, especially the collective singing of the national anthem, and how this chant emerges in pivotal points of the film, or the concept of preserving the dignity of the dead and dying by not filming that violence, which clearly is in contrast to what we are seeing today from the war in Ukraine. Thank you. And now I will turn to our first speaker, distinguished professor, lecturer of Ukrainian studies, and early modern Slavonic literature and art at Cambridge University, who has published a number of important articles that deal with both the medieval legacy of Byzantium in Ukrainian art and its conversation with Western tradition, more specifically Baroque. Olenka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bistra. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So first, I would like to warn our audiences that I do have disturbing images in my presentation. So if anyone is sensitive, please, I don't know, turn off the screen and just listen, but here it goes. In the early hours of February 24th, the Russian Federation launched an unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine by air and sea, using tanks, aviation, and rocket launchers. Attacks targeted Kyiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, Chernihiv, Dnipro, Mariupol, and other cities and towns. Torture, rape, and mass murder, torture, rape, and mass murder of civilians, including children, the intentional shelling of hospitals and apartment blocks, the deliberate destruction of urban infrastructures, and the bombing of humanitarian corridors are just some of the war crimes being committed in the Russian-waged genocide against the Ukrainian nation. This war touches all of us. At stake is the faith of democracy, of freedom, of human rights, and of the international order that has marked our world since the beginning of the 1990s. How can this happen in the 21st century, we wonder? Do we ever learn from the past? In his speeches, President Putin has deceitfully asserted that Ukraine is not a nation, but a Russian territory from which the Bolshevik communists irresponsibly created a Ukrainian state in the 1920s. Like the great Russian teleological narrative that gained prevalence in the 19th century Russian Empire and that was propagated and elaborated in Soviet times, he claims that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people who trace their origins to a vast ancient Rus state. This great Russian narrative follows a lineal trajectory from Kyiv to the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, to the Grand Duchy and Tsardom of Muscovy, and subsequently to the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and today's Russia. This narrative also underpins the field of Slavonic studies in Western educational and academic institutions, where there is a marked reluctance to adopt a decolonization agenda in the teaching and studying of Eastern Europe. I wonder, have we contributed to the resonance of Putin's version of history? All peoples engage in myths of origin that help position them in this world. These myths are subject to transitions and reformations that go hand in hand with changes in knowledge and science, in technology and language. They are spatially situated and ring true within the communities and worlds they define. Today, we all stand witness to the fact that Ukrainians do not want Russia to interfere in their domestic affairs. They do not seek Russian liberation. In fact, they are sacrificing their lives to keep Russia out of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine have their own vision of their land, their culture, their history, and their nation. They aspire to be free, to live in a sovereign, independent state, and to make their own choices. They have made these desires clear in numerous referendums and revolutions since the fall of the Soviet Union, and have consistently chosen a path towards Europe and NATO. Perhaps it is time for us to reconsider the place of the great Russian narrative in our educational and research agendas, and to challenge ourselves by investigating the primary sources that speak of the others that this narrative, this great Russian narrative, has obscured. It may be that the future of Eastern European studies no longer lies in the study of Russia, but in the tales of the diverse cultural legacies of the varied peoples that inhabited and inhabit this part of the world. In the current political discourse between Russia and Ukraine, the ownership of medieval Kievan history is once again at stake. However, it is not the present claims to Kyiv that I will address today. Rather, I aim to tell the story of Kyiv's medieval inheritance from the perspective of the city's early modern inhabitants, as evidenced in the architecture and imagery of the Church of the Savior on the Berestovo Hill. This Kievan church was built in the late 11th, early 12th century and renewed in 1644 under the patronage of Petro Mohyla, Metropolitan of Kyiv, Halych, and all Rus, and Exarch of the throne of Constantinople. At this time, Kyiv was part of the Ruthenian Rus lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The renewal of the Church of the Savior witnessed the kaleidoscopic vigor that characterized Ruthenian Rus culture in early modern Kyiv. From the amorphous ruins of a medieval church, Metropolitan Mohyla brought to life a sacred space that linked Ruthenian Rus Eastern Christianity with Kyiv's Christian beginnings. In doing so, Mohyla aspired to advance the status of Eastern Christianity and of the Ruthenian Rus nation within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He envisioned Kyiv as a leading center of Christianity positioned between Constantinople and Rome, and saw himself as the earthly head of the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox Church. Petro Mohyla realized that the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox Church had to adapt to survive and not lose ground to the Catholic and Protestant churches of the Commonwealth. Like many of his erudite Ruthenian contemporaries, he adopted Western practices to suit his needs. His written works all sought to clarify and regulate Orthodox custom and practice in response to the demands of a Ruthenian Rus society, which, although still Orthodox in the majority, now also was comprised of Catholics and Protestants. In his works, Mohyla employed techniques for the systemization of knowledge that relied on both Western European and Byzantine sources. He approached the use of visual culture with a similar reformative hand. Thus, the mid-17th century forms of the restored church at Berestovo do not repeat those of the early Rus period. I'm going to go back a slide because I think I've messed up the orders of the slides. Instead, they negotiate Orthodox traditionalism and notions of Ruthenian ethno-cultural identity with the Reformation and Counter-Reformation developments. Recent scholarship has shown that the Ruthenian Orthodox of the 17th century were conversant with the discipline of memory arts that systemized information by using mnemonic images and schemata. In addition to conjuring the holy, now images served as loci for meditation, invention, and memory. Such engagement with and reflection upon images enabled sacred history to assume approximate relevance. Take, for example, the depiction of the vision of St. Peter of Alexandria, found on the left side of the sanctuary apse in the church at Berestovo. Here, Christ appears to St. Peter as a child, wearing a robe torn from top to bottom. St. Peter asks the Savior, "Who tore this garment?" And the Savior replies, "The heretic Arius has torn it by dividing the Christian faithful." In Orthodox iconography, this image with the motif of the torn garment came to symbolize church schisms and carried liturgical connotations, the breaking of the Eucharistic bread. In the Kyiv church, we see Peter conversing with the young Jesus, who stands on an altar. The inscription reads, "Who tore your chitin, Savior?" And the Savior replies, "Arius, the mad and all evil, Peter." The inscribed dialogue plays upon the homonymous relationship of patron and apostle and evokes an immediate relevance in the context of the efforts led by Metropolitan Mohyla to bring an end to the division of the Ruthenian Rus Church between those united and those not united with the papacy. The Metropolitan's Testament of 1647 clearly discloses the importance assigned to the Berestova Church. But his renewal of this monument resonated beyond the Metropolitan's inner circles. The zealously Orthodox Zaporizhian Cossacks threatened to drown Mohyla in the Dnipro River and to lead him to his grave for restoring the ceiling of the Berestova Church to resemble a Catholic shrine. They were referencing the decorative rib vaults framing the Byzantine-style frescoes in the sanctuary of the church. And here you see these ribs. The renewed Church of the Savior is reminiscent of the early 15th century Catholic chapel of the Holy Trinity in the Lublin Castle, with the rib vaulting of both structures forming a compelling visual parallel. The melding of artistic traditions associated with both Byzantine and Latin Christianity characterized the culturally fluid areas connecting Polish, Lithuanian, and Ruthenian Rus lands. Mohyla's early modern renovation of the Church of the Savior looks back to the Lublin tradition and radically transforms it. Whereas in Lublin, Byzantine images decorated the walls and webbing of a Gothic structure used in the service of the Catholic Church, in Kyiv, Gothic ribs are added as decorative elements to a structure rooted in the medieval Rus past and used in the service of the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox Church. Within the Berestova Church, the imagery of the star-filled heavens in the vault of the narthex blankets prophets, scenes of the Passion of Christ, and standing monastics that decorate the walls. The imagery links the cosmic and terrestrial realms and aspires to advance the Ruthenian Rus Church within universal Christianity. The circular mandala containing the image of Christ is inscribed with the words of the prayer of the pontiff from the little entrance in the pontifical mass. O Lord, our God, look down from the heavens and behold and visit this vineyard, which thy right hand has planted and perfected, and fill it with your spirit, and bless thy inheritance. The reference of this inscription is clearly Eucharistic. However, these same words also were inscribed on the mitre of Kyiv, the first patriarch of Moscow. In 1633, when the Polish king Władysław appointed Mohyla to the metropolitan throne of Kyiv, his royal title referenced his 1610 election as Grand Duke of Muscovy. Within the Commonwealth, King Władysław was concerned to avert the development of bonds between the Orthodox faithful of Ruthenian Rus and Muscovite lands. In 1636, he issued a circular calling on the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox and Ruthenian Rus Catholic churches to join in union, to declare independence from Constantinople, and to create their own Kievan Patriarchate following Moscow's example. This new patriarchate could then join Rome in the formation of a universal church. Mohyla was in favor of the proposal. Nevertheless, due to opposition from both Rome and some Orthodox faithful, the plan never materialized. In 1643, Pope Urban VIII wrote to Mohyla, calling upon him to bring the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox Church into union with Rome. Mohyla was amiably disposed to the idea and participated in drafting a response to the Pope. The response proposed a compromise regarding the jurisdictional relation of the Kyiv Metropolitanate to the Holy See and to the Patriarch of Constantinople. The response preserved the Eastern Rite and positioned the Kyiv hierarchy as independent from both Rome and Constantinople, with nominal recognition of papal primacy. Correspondence exchanged between Mohyla and the Orthodox Brotherhood of Vilnius indicates that in Orthodox circles, the creation of a patriarchate was considered imminent. The Church of the Savior in Berestovo was renovated concurrently with the drafting of the response to Pope Urban VIII. In the church, Metropolitan Mohyla's donor portrait is set over the arch leading into the sanctuary. It shows the Mother of God presenting the kneeling Metropolitan to Christ, who sits enthroned as the great pontiff. Mohyla offers the Berestovo church to Christ. To the other side of Christ stands the haloed Prince Volodymyr, the baptizer of Rus. These are the inscriptions associated with the figure of Mohyla and with Christ, and this is Prince Volodymyr. A number of scholars have pondered the significance of the juxtaposition of Mohyla, an ecclesiastical hierarch, with Prince Volodymyr. Some have suggested that Mohyla traced his own lineage back to Volodymyr, but Mohyla was insistent that he was an ecclesiastical and not a secular leader. The Berestovo donor portrait does not posit a direct relationship between the Metropolitan and Prince Volodymyr. Rather, it refers to the conditions that preoccupied Mohyla and his compatriots in the arbitration of the Ruthenian Rus Church unity and in the mediation of the position of the Ruthenian Church within the Universal Church. In the context of the 1640s, the presence of both Petro Mohyla and Prince Volodymyr in the donor fresco should be read against the background of ecclesiastical negotiations that were guided by the nobility, here represented by Volodymyr, and that would bestow patriarchal-like powers on the Kievan Metropolitan. The column depicted before Prince Volodymyr also has caught the attention of art historians. In the early modern period, the motif of the freestanding column was symbolic of the columns of Hercules and read as a pledge to expand Christian rule to all corners of the earth. Of specific relevance in the context of the Berestovo Church is the representation of the four patriarchs of Eastern Christianity as the four columns of the church that is found in contemporary Ruthenian Rus texts. It is likely that the column in the fresco was a marker of the extension of Christianity to Rus lands under Prince Volodymyr and a possible symbol of Kyiv's anticipated primal dignity, if not patriarchal status, primatial dignity, if not patriarchal status in the Universal Church. In the context of the Great Russian narrative, the Church of the Savior in Berestovo is primarily recognized as the mid-12th century burial site of Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, the founder of Moscow. Except for a handful of short articles, the early modern structure and wall paintings of the monument remain unanalyzed. Nevertheless, even this short survey of the church makes clear that for Metropolitan Mohyla and his compatriots, early modern Kyiv was in no way beholden to Moscow. Kyiv was the Ruthenian Rus Orthodox center of the Commonwealth, and as such actively participated in the transnational discourses of the Universal Church. Or to look at it from another perspective, by confirming the pious traditions and legends surrounding Kievan Rus, Metropolitan Mohyla and his ecclesiastical literati we're writing the history of the Ruthenian Rus Church and filling a gap in the narrative of the Universal Church as drafted by their Roman contemporaries. In either case, the history of Kyiv in the early modern period participated in the making of Ukrainian cultural distinctiveness.
Thank you, Olenka, for this very insightful talk that shows really the long tradition of shaping Ukrainian identity, which is continuously negotiated, in which the past, the medieval past, appears and is transformed in the Baroque period, and then, as we're going to hear from our next speaker, in the early modern as well. So I will turn now to our second speaker, Bohdan Tokarsky, who finished his PhD at Cambridge University and is now a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the University of Potsdam. Bohdan, the word is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Bisera, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for holding this extremely important event. And I would like to make my small contribution speaking about this middle period, as it were, between, on the one hand, the time of the making of the artistic tradition of the initial making of the artistic tradition of Ukraine, and at the same time, the new time after the independence, and to speak specifically about the Ukrainian modernist art. And in fact, the history of Ukrainian modernism is the story of innovation and tradition, cosmopolitanism, and the articulation of national identity. It's also a story of art and politics, of course. And it is a crucial period, in fact, for understanding both those events that are ongoing, unfolding before our eyes as we speak, as we hold this event, this Russia's war, horrific war against Ukraine. And on the one hand, it is steeped firmly in the Ukrainian artistic tradition that precedes it. And at the same time, it looks forward into the time to come, because as I will try to show, the importance of this legacy hardly can be overestimated, the importance of this legacy for Ukraine today. Of course, at the same time, we should also say that many of the patterns that we even see unfolding before our eyes with the war that is happening, in fact, took place already during this time, 1910s and 1920s. And it is not for nothing that in his pseudo-historical lectures, Putin is trying to make a specific emphasis on this period of the 1910s and of the 1920s. And so I will try and comment on that as well. But at the same time, we should say that the importance of Ukrainian modernism and Ukrainian avant-garde should not be confined to the current events alone, should not be confined to the current newspaper reality, as it were. And in fact, it should be given a voice of its own, and it should be subject of thorough and deep research, which unfortunately has not been part of the tradition of modernist studies. In fact, all too often, the Ukrainian avant-garde, Ukrainian modernism more generally, is sorely missing in the studies on modernism, rather, I should say, more generally. And of course, it is high time we change this. So let me start by referring to one specific painting, and in particular the painting by Vasil Sedlar, one of the Portuguese paintings that artists, that is one of those artists who were part of the Portuguese school, that is the school that was headed by Mikhailo Bulchuk, one of the leading Ukrainian modernist artists of the 1910s and 1920s. In this painting, we can see, and actually let me show you an original version of this painting, which was preserved through a postcard. We can see a subject matter which would very much conform to the Bolshevik narrative. It dates back to 1927, this painting, so we need to take on board this time as well. And it depicts the whites killing the peasants. And of course, on the level of the subject matter, this painting does conform to the narrative that the Bolsheviks were trying to impose and co-opt art in articulating and promoting this narrative. But at the same time, this painting is an epitome of quite a few important aspects that I would like to raise today within the time that I have. So on the one hand, and the title of this painting, very importantly, is the execution in Mazhagiria, right? Very tragically, this execution act in this diabolical reversal of history later on, within just a decade, happened to Vasil Sedlar himself and the whole of the Bolshevist school. And indeed, Vasil Sedlar, along Mikhailo Boychuk and other artists from the school, were executed during Stalin's Great Terror, along with the absolute majority of Ukrainian modernist figures. Very important element of this painting, and the reason why, one of the reasons why Vasil Sedlar himself was executed, and in fact the painting was executed, as you can see on this slide, the current state of the painting, most likely an attempt to destroy the painting by using acid by the Bolsheviks. So destroying art along with the artists. So we can see that even though in terms of the subject matter, this painting conforms to the narrative, the Bolshevik narrative, in terms of the actual form and the performance or the pictorial elements of this painting, it does not necessarily fit easily into the nascent Soviet canon. We can look at these elements, specific elements in the painting, which have a really poignant relevance given the events of the war today as well, because this painting really captures the excruciating emotions that people are going through in Ukraine as we speak. And here indeed parts of the difference, or part of the way in which Sedlar is at odds with the Bolshevik narrative or with the socialist realist approach is by referring back to the previous tradition, and in particular the Italian Renaissance tradition, or Giotto, for example, who was a great authority for the Portuguese artists. And so in many such ways, this painting is of course at odds with the art that was imposed and the artistic principles that were imposed on the artists. And this very place of Mazhagiria, which was where the Institute of Ceramics was established back in the early 1920s, where Sedlar, along with other Portuguese artists, worked, has a great significance as well, because it was a seat and a place for the Mazhagiria monastery that's coming back to the period that Olenka has already told us about just now. This monastery was demolished in the 1930s. And so this place of Mazhagiria has a very important role in that sense as well, as site of the destruction of art and the tradition in this sense. And this monastery was turned instead into a state dacha, and then very sadly later on was appropriated by Viktor Yanukovych, whom I'm sure you have heard of. So the topic of our conversation tonight is moments and movements, and indeed movement is at the very heart of Ukrainian modernism and avant-garde, as it is at the heart of avant-garde and modernism more generally, of course. Whether we look at the visual arts, and specifically at fine arts. And we'll look, for example, at a painting like the one you see on the left by Alexander Bohumazov, Tram from 1914, really capturing this dynamic nature of movement related to the process of modernization and urbanization. Whether we look, for example, at the theater, modernist innovative theater created by Les Kurbas, the leading innovative revolutionary, we could say, theater director for the 1920s and 1930s in Ukraine. And you can see on the right an image from one of his productions where movement has such a central role, and I will speak about that more in a second. Movement also plays an extremely important role in a very physical sense, in the sense of traveling, which there was a striking amount of traveling, in fact, in the 1910s and 1920s. And many of the artists who either were at the very core of the Ukrainian modernist movement or contributed to it a lot, in fact, traveled to other European countries, to other European cities, be it Berlin or Paris or Munich or Zurich, and many of them studied there. So Les Kurbas himself visited these cities, some of these cities. Mikhailo Buchuk did, Alexander Ekster, and many, many other artists. At the same time, movement is very important when we speak about the notion of national and artistic affiliations and hyphenated identities as well, because of course, so much of Ukrainian art has been subsumed very erroneously and very unfortunately and tragically has been subsumed within the notion of Soviet or even worse, Russian. And that is how this art is very often either ignored completely or included into this umbrella misnomer of the Russian avant-garde. And that is another extremely crucial aspect because many of the artists that we know as traditionally known as part of the Russian avant-garde, be it again Alexander Ekster or be it David Burluk, or be it Kazimir Malevich, were in fact people of multiple hyphenated identities, both in terms of their national affiliation and in terms of their artistic affiliation as well. And even a quick look at places, for example, at Kyiv, already gives us a very clear idea about how dynamic and diverse this environment was, and that we by no means can confine it to the notion of the Russian avant-garde. Either when we look at the Kyiv Art School, they had a great number of really prominent graduates, be it Alexander Ekster or Vadim Meller or Ivan Kavaleridze and many others. Whether we look at, for example, the 1908 the so-called Lanka or Zveno or Link exhibition, one of the first avant-garde exhibitions that took place in Kyiv. And many other examples, or the activities of the Kulturliga in Ukraine in the early 20th century, which made Kyiv into one of the centers of the Yiddish art, the Yiddish culture as well, or Ukrainian Art Institute, where Kazimir Malevich and Vladimir Tatlin and Mikhailo Buchuk taught in the late 1920s, and where Malevich, whose art wasn't welcome anymore in Moscow and Leningrad, taught at this time and wrote a great number of works which were published in Nova Generacija journal, for example, edited by Mikhail Simonko, the central futurist in Ukraine. So this clearly shows to us the importance of movement in this sense, and Kyiv and Ukraine in general being this crisscross of influences and contexts, be it Ukrainian or Russian or Jewish or Western European. Now, when it comes to moments next to movements, a very crucial moment for Ukrainian history, and one that had also great impact on the development of Ukrainian culture, was the 1917 revolution. And when I say when I use the definitive article, again here, notice that I use it not to refer to the 1917 revolution, as is commonly the case to speak about the Russian Revolution of 1917, but to the Ukrainian Revolution, which was one of the multiple national revolutions that took place over the territory of the former Russian Empire. And again, that calls into question the simplistic and misnomer notion of the revolution. Here you can see a manifestation that took place on the 19th of March, where thousands of people took to the streets in this act of liberation and acts of renewal, welcoming the emergence of a new state, welcoming the emergence of a new page in the history of development of Ukrainian nation. And according to some memoirs, there were up to 100,000 people who took part in these manifestations, which of course very much calls into question, even though I don't want to comment on it more, Putin's quasi-historian references to Ukraine called after Lenin, and cannot, of course, explain where these dozens of thousands of people came from in 1917. And this moment of national elation was really captured in Alexander Dovzhenko's film, Arsenal. And you can see some frames from it. You can see this image next to Saint Sophia Cathedral, and you can see Dovzhenko himself being there. And indeed, Dovzhenko eventually rewrote his own biography, because to begin with, he was fighting on the side of the UNR, the Ukrainian People's Republic, and eventually in this film, he was trying to show the attack on Arsenal on the other side, showing it from the Bolshevik perspective, even though he was one of those soldiers who were actually attacking the Bolsheviks during the moment, historical moment of the attack of the Arsenal factory in 1918. So very quickly, I can see that I have a couple of minutes left. I would also like to say that a very distinctive feature of Ukrainian modernism was the fact that even though there were, of course, many examples of where tradition and innovation were combined in the history of modernism, in the Ukrainian case, innovation was largely created through tradition. And there are multiple examples of that. And as I'm short of time, I want to just give one specific example of the productions by Les Kurbas, like I mentioned, the leading innovative theater director in the Ukrainian 1920s and 1930s, who directed a number of productions that involved elements of the Baroque theater, of the Vartap theater, this Baroque puppet theater, and a nativity scene reaching back to the tradition of the 16th and 17th, mostly 17th century. And again, trying to combine, on the one hand, this reference to the past, reference to the theatrical tradition, and at the same time, the use of modernist innovation in his production of 1919, for example, which was specifically called Vartap. He was trying to use this nativity scene and these scenes from the Baroque theater, but using that not as a puppet theater, as a two-story small wooden box, but rather to have his actors actually perform the roles of the puppets, saying that this production, on the one hand, is really steeped in the tradition of the Ukrainian theater, but at the same time is really innovative in the way it treats the body. He says we should distance ourselves from ourselves. We should forget the human logic. We should act like a puppet would act. So again, this beautiful organic combination of the tradition and the national aspect, but at the same time, this universal modernist idiom. There are multiple other examples of how these elements of tradition and innovation were combined. You can see this futuristic poetry of Mikhail Semenko on the right, next to some examples of Baroque poetry on the left. And you can see some paintings by Mikhailo Buchuk as well, who was combining these elements of using elements of mosaic and iconography and elements of reference to the Kyivan medieval legacy and heritage as well in creating his modernist art. This period, the modernist period in Ukraine, is most commonly referred to as executed Renaissance, and there are many caveats about this notion, but very sadly, it also does convey the painful historical truth about the fact that Ukrainian modernists were executed en masse. The vast majority of Ukrainian modernists were executed, including Les Kurbas, including Mikhailo Buchuk, including Vasil Sedlar, whose work I started with. And this is an example of how this trauma is reactivated, as it were. On the left, you can see the Slovo House, which was a home to a great number of Ukrainian modernists in Kharkiv, which was the Ukrainian capital and the capital of Ukrainian modernism at this time, and which was most recently bombed and shelled rather during this war. You can also see the example Kharkiv being one of the centers of Soviet constructivism as well. And I'm sure that you all would have heard about the bombing of the Freedom Square at the very center, the very heart, the largest square in Europe, the very heart of Kharkiv, right next to the building of Dashprom, one of these masterpieces of Soviet constructivism. And all this art that was executed, not only the artists were executed, but the art itself was erased from the public discourse in the Soviet Union and was only rediscovered to begin with in the 1960s, but mostly in the 1990s. And to end my presentation, I just want to say that in the 1990s, Ukrainian artists and Ukrainian public at large only started to discover mostly this incredible heritage, this incredible art from the 1920s, from the 1930s, which was erased and annihilated by the subsequent Soviet purges. And that's one of the reasons why Ukrainian modernism from the time has such a crucial role to play for Ukrainians today. And that is why, of course, it is so relevant in the context of this war. And modernism is not just one period among many others, but rather a period that is bound up firmly with such questions as cultural memory, as trauma, as discovery of art, as women's art. And for this reason, among many other reasons, has to be studied. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bogdan, thank you very much for this another magnificent talk that joins Olenka. And maybe I could bring back the words of Olenka, that we need to decolonize Eastern European studies. This is really at the core, and both talks are really consistently showing that there are moments in which incredible artistic synthesis is created in order to negotiate an Ukrainian identity. What we saw with Olenka, medieval and Baroque, and what we saw with Bogdan is this drawing on both medieval Byzantine examples as well as Western Renaissance and Baroque to create avant-garde, and also relying so much of the legacy of the Baroque in Ukraine. So it is in step, in a sense. It reminds me of the inscription on the tomb of Freud in Vienna, that the scholar speaks softly, but he would not or she would not rest until it's heard. So I now turn to Elisa, who is a PhD student in the Central European University in Budapest, and whose work is focused on contemporary art. And it is she's our eyes to the very rich contemporary art scene in Ukraine. Elisa, the word is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this awesome seminar. I think it's extremely important to speak about this long history of Ukrainian art and how it interacts, like different periods reflect each other in a way. So today I will be speaking about art of the last 3 decades. I'm not focusing today particularly on the art of the war because it's another big and important topic, but today we will see the conditions which made it possible for Ukrainians to realize their identity as a separate nation, as a separate independent state, and through drastic transformations in Ukrainian recent art history and Ukrainian contemporary art as well. I'll start sharing my screen. One second. So yeah. In the last 3 decades, Ukraine went through 3 major socio-historical milestones which shaped the country's political and cultural landscape. These events deeply transformed Ukrainian society and coincided with 3 major waves of artistic activity in the country. Artists were not only influenced by the historic transformations, but became important agents of social change who directly participated in the events and to a certain extent shaped them. In the end of 1980s and at the beginning of 1990s was the time when Ukraine was transforming from one of the Soviet republics into an independent state. This brought a lot of challenges and first of all posed the question of national identity, which both the artists and the society on the whole were trying to conceptualize at the time. All 3 waves of mass mobilization in recent Ukrainian history were centered around the Ukrainian capital's main square. In 1990, it was called the Square of the October Revolution, and since 1991, its official name is Independence Square, Майдан Незалежності in Ukrainian. The first mass turbulence, the Granite Revolution, lasted from October 2nd to October 17th, 1990, and took its name from the material that Kyiv's central square was made of. The protest consisted of a hunger strike of the members of the Lviv Students' Brotherhood and the Ukrainian Students' Union. By the time of the Granite Revolution, the language of political performance was already a familiar tool of artistic expression in Soviet Ukraine. Back in 1989, the Youth Revolutionary Patriotic Union, called the Rays of Juche, was created in Kyiv. The organization, which in fact was an art project in disguise, was invented by students Mykola Polishchuk and Dmitro Polyukhovich. The Rays of Juche is a bright page of early Ukrainian political performance. The peak of the group's activity was 1990 and 1991. Burlesque actions and interventions of the Rays of Juche were mocking the ideology of North Korean communists and in particular the magazines Korea and Korea Today. The propaganda editions of the Korean communists in the late Soviet era looked like an ideal art parody of the decaying USSR with its pompous slogans and excessive rituals. Juche was a local North Korean leader Kim Il-sung version of Korean Marxism. Armed with a masquerade North Korean entourage, the young founders of the Rays of Juche dissected the absurdity of Soviet everyday reality. Another important phenomenon of the era was the so-called Mazov Fund art group from Lviv. Among the fund's most famous projects was the Mausoleum for the President, made in 1994, a performance near the National Art Museum of Ukraine in Kyiv. The event was held on the eve of the second presidential election in the history of independent Ukraine. Artists invited guests to the opening of their art performance without giving any additional details. At the appointed place at the entrance of the main art museum of the country, the audience saw a mysterious object covered with white cloth. When the performance began, the fabric was removed and under it, there appeared a 3-liter jar with traditional Ukrainian lard. Putting the jar on a portable hot plate, the artists began to slowly melt the fat. When the lard got transparent, the viewer saw in a jar the portrait of Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, I'm sorry. The provocative political action was accompanied by a fiery speech by one of the group's members, Igor Podolchak, on the steps of the museum and caused a big scandal. The next turn in the development of contemporary art in Ukraine happened in 2004 and was influenced by another wave of political protests in the country. A new generation of artists emerged. It was ideologically opposed to those who came in late 1980s and early 1990s. From November 22nd through December 26, 2004, Ukraine again faced a large-scale wave of political protests. They were again centered around Kyiv's main square, the Maidan of Independence. A quick rise of oligarchy was one of the main problems of the era. The country's enormous resources fell into the hands of several warring political and economic groups. The Orange Revolution and its pre-election campaign, according to the Swedish economist and diplomat Anders Aslund, were the struggle of millionaires against billionaires. But it was also a protest of the nascent middle class, the voice of a generation that had formed after the collapse of the USSR and did not want to live in the country ruled by corrupt politicians, ultra-rich oligarchs, and gangsters. Orange Revolution, as its name implies, had a distinctive aesthetic component. Bright, energetic color became a marker of protesters and filled Ukraine's capital and other cities. Some researchers called the event of 2004 the Orange Visual Revolution and interpreted them as the destruction of the classical system of power by means of postmodern technologies. In 2004, despite the unprecedented concentration of people in the center of Kyiv and their protest mood, the situation was absolutely non-violent. I'll get back to a couple of pictures. These are very symptomatic. And the main tool of political resistance was artistic expression, folk performances, costume marches with their specific humor, slogans, and songs. The atmosphere of orange protests, saturated with visual symbols, was documented by two video artists from Odessa, Gleb Kachuk and Olga Kashimbekova, in their short film, The Velvet Labyrinth, made in 2004. On the last night before the dismantlement of the revolutionary tents and barricades, the artists walked along Kyiv's main street, from Khreshchatyk metro station to the Maidan of Independence. They filmed winter barricades and their inhabitants twined with orange ribbons. To these visually expressive panoramas, artists added even stranger elements using the computer graphics. Among everyday scenes from the life of a dying protest, with all the political slogans and abundance of orange color, an image of Mona Lisa suddenly appears. Barbie and Ken toys radiantly smile from the barricades, and in a couple of meters, a space rocket takes off. Gradually, it becomes obvious that the whole performance is the theater of absurd or a vivid but meaningless hallucination. In this atmosphere, the new generation of artists comes onto the scene. It all starts on the Maidan. Revolutionary carnival stimulates the release of adrenaline and creative energy. Young students of the National Academy of Art, as well as recent graduates and other creative personalities, take part in the protests. Very soon, the director of former George Soros Center of Contemporary Art, Jerzy Onoch, offered them an artistic residence at the Art Center. After a few weeks, on December 2004, an exhibition titled Revolutionary Experimental Space opened. It gave birth to one of the most prominent art collectives of the 2000s, the Rap Group. Involvement in the practices of street democracy during the Orange Revolution, along with interest in the legacy of Moscow actionism, gave impetus to the formation of a recognizable language of the group's early works. Rap begins to work as a collective author, focusing on actions interventions into the public space. In the 2005 project, the revolutionary drive with its collective party energy is still tangible. At the same time, a critical vector is already being outlined here. It will become a hallmark of all future projects of the group. The romantic mood is being replaced by time to ask questions about the outcome of the protests. Rap's action, intervention, and we will rap you are built according to a similar scenario. A group of performers invades the fabric of the real and using it as a decoration creates its own burlesque performance. We Will Rap You takes place on November 7th amid a demonstration by the Communist Party and a rally of nationalists, accompanied by a prayer service. A critical aspect comes to the fore here. Disguised performers become a mirror of society, where political masquerade has become a topical phenomenon. In October 2005, the Soska art group appeared on the Kharkiv stage. Its path in art was in many ways similar to the Kyiv's rap. It became obvious that a new generation of artists had come to the scene who shared the same views and methods. Like rap, the Soska group in its first projects used the elements of the language of the Orange Revolution's political protests. Future members of Soska had a critical view of the surrounding reality even before they created the group. In October 2004, on the eve of mass protests of Kyiv's Maidan, future members of the group, Mykola Ridny and Bella Logachova, held a performance in Kharkiv Municipal Gallery. They splashed white paint on the portraits of all the politicians participating in the election race. The initial stage of the group's activity coincides with the period of political turbulence in the country, which is reflected in Soska's works. Mykola Ridny, Anna Kriventsova, and Sergei Popov's action, They Are on the Street, which was made in 2006, is very symptomatic in this context. On the eve of the election, the artists asked for alms, wearing masks of Ukrainian politicians, the president, prime minister, and opposition leader. Absurd scenes in the subway and on the streets of Kyiv with the participation of talking heads from TV became a metaphor for the state of Ukraine, where politicians were fabulously enriched, turning into puppets for large oligarchs, and the country continued to drown in poverty. The artists of the post-Orange wave were deeply interested in critical art, the left-wing optics, and political activism. It is no coincidence that their criticism was focused on the post-Soviet rather than Soviet society, with its prolonged political crisis and conflict of values. Unlike the artists who emerged during Perestroika, this circle embraced the leftist critical optics and apparatus, which they did not associate with the trauma of Ukraine's communist past anymore. Moreover, they recognized the political element in art in the same manner as it was understood by the international leftist intellectuals and political artists of the time. The Revolution of Dignity started on November 21st, 2013, and lasted till February 22nd, 2014. It was the first and by now the most dramatic turbulence in the newest Ukrainian history. Turbulence, I mean, without the intervention of other countries. A number of young artists who sided with the informal Bacteria Gallery joined the protests at the early stage. Most active amongst them were Oleksiy Mann, Ivan Semisyuk, and Andriy Yermolenko. In 2013, they broke into the Ukrainian art scene with flamboyant works that reflected ironically on the most unsavory sides of the new Ukrainian realities, including the life of thugs, roughnecks, and other residents of the lumpenized outskirts of Ukrainian metropolises. The Maidan became these artists' true finest hour. They did not leave the barricades even in the bloodiest days and set up a makeshift gallery and the communication center on the barricades at the entrance to the Maidan, right in the middle of Kreshchatyk Street. It was very aptly named Mistetsky Barbican, the art Barbican, Barbican being a defensive outwork of medieval fortifications designed to protect the city gates. The shock caused by the bloody events at the end of At the end of Maidan protests, Russian annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbas have become a traumatic experience for Ukrainian artistic community. For many artists who took active part in the Maidan events, this period was the time of a post-revolutionary hangover, an emotional drama that was hard to express in a single artwork. To others, on the contrary, this very period gave impetus to work on new subjects, problems, and projects. A noticeable phenomenon was the documentaries about the Maidan and further events made by film director and artist Alexei Radinsky, an activist of the Visual Culture Research Center. Particularly important was his film People Who Came to Power, made in 2015, co-authored with Slovakian artist and filmmaker Tomasz Rafa, focused on the initial stages of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. At this period, a new generation of artists made its debut on the art scene. Its most interesting representative was Roman Mikhailov from Kharkiv. In 2014, the artist created Shadows, the installation showing scorched shipwrecks. In this piece, Mikhailov reflects upon the Russian annexation of Crimea and the destiny of the Black Sea Navy fleet that had become the bone of contention between Russia and Ukraine for decades. Another important Mikhailov's project began at Maidan, where the artist hot smoked the paper for graphic works over the burning barrels in the tent camp behind the barricades. Later, this series developed into gigantic sheets of scorched paper. One of the most politically engaged female artists of the post-Maidan epoch is Maria Kulikovska. Her performance at the 2014 Manifesta in St. Petersburg became enormously famous. To protest against the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine, she wrapped herself up in the Ukrainian flag on one of the Hermitage staircases. No less famous was her performance, The Crimea Float Board, during which the artist drifted on a float board down the Dnieper without any food reserve in order to emphasize the vulnerability of people who lost their homes and native land after the annexation of Crimea. Before the Maidan Revolution, Kulikovska started a series that featured the castings of her own body. Her works from this series were exhibited, among others, at the only contemporary art institution in Donetsk, the Izolyatsiya Art Center. During the armed conflict in Donetsk, the factory that housed this institution was taken over by separatists and Russian soldiers who turned the art center into a prison for pro-Ukrainian people and executed symbolically Maria Kulikovska's sculptures by using them for target practice. In 2015, in remembrance of this event, the artist staged her performance Happy Birthday at the Saatchi Gallery in London. In the course of this performance, the naked artist hammered down the soap castings of herself as an answer to the separatists who destroyed her artworks. Kyiv artist Vlada Ralko was perhaps the best to catch the growing tragedy of Maidan. Her Kyiv diary is based on her day-to-day observations of the events. It is a graphic series that records the emotion and feelings of almost every day between December 2013 and a relative de-escalation of the war in the Donbas in 2015. The challenges of the second half of the 2010s inspired a significant wave of cultural activity in Ukraine and brought a new ambitious generation to the art scene. The rage of revolution and war, political and economic instability within the country, mixed with the anxieties and uncertainties of contemporary world in general. In the narrow space between all the turbulences and challenges, a territory of new freedom was blossoming. In the next several years of the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, became one of the world capitals of the rave movement. Dance culture became an antidote to deep trauma and political absurd. The paradox of young Ukrainian art is that it combines the escapism and the phantasmal psychedelic experience of the rave with highly political senses and projects. The works of contemporary Ukrainian artists are highly critical and reflect the experience of existing in the context of constant unrest. And to end my presentation, I want to say that there is something that connects all our three speeches, and this is Mezhyhirya. Mezhyhirya, which was the monastery in the medieval Ukraine, then was this scene of this execution showed by Bohdan in his slides. And again, in my personal story, it was a very important place, because in 2014, days after our ex-president Viktor Yanukovych escaped from his luxurious palace in Mezhyhirya, which costed probably billions of dollars, I was among a group of museum workers who were trying to prevent the looting in the Mezhyhirya, and we spent like several weeks documenting the how to say it, the aftermath of the revolution and the peaceful takeover of this palace, which now belongs to Ukrainian people, and where now the great park is situated. And I also, with my colleague and artist Alexander Roydberg, created an exhibition of the so-called treasures of Mezhyhirya, this weird mix of kitschy golden chandeliers and really expensive artworks, icons, old manuscripts, everything that was like given to our former president Viktor Yanukovych's presents and bribes, and which was abandoned in this estate and given after the revolution by the self-defense troops to the Ukrainian museums. Thank you very much.
Elisa Luskina, thank you very much for this fascinating talk that brings the different aspects of decolonizing Eastern European studies in focus. And now I'm going to turn to the two respondents. One is, the first person who would speak is Daria Storoshchuk, who is a PhD student in Russian and Eastern European studies here at Stanford. And the second speaker is going to be Lilia Dashevsky, who is a PhD student also in Russian and Eastern European studies at Yale. I'm not going to introduce them further, so first Daria is going to speak for approximately 5 minutes, and then the word will go to Lilia. Thank you both. So Daria.
Thank you. Thank you all for your wonderful, incisive talks and for being so generous with your time today and sharing your research with us. As Bisra said, I'm in the interest of leaving as much time as possible for discussion. I'm just going to jump right into my comments and questions. Lilia will follow, and then we'll turn things back over to the panelists for their responses and to start off the general discussion. So first, Olenka, thank you so much. To echo Bisra, I think your call for an attention to decolonializing scholarship is so important, especially in this moment where, as you noted, memory politics are playing such an active role in the current political discourse. And indeed, that tension that you draw out in the Mohyla era of Ukrainian visuality's positioning between the Byzantine East and Western Europe continues to be really actual today, even and perhaps especially, I think, beyond the visual. We're continually seeing it drawn upon as a really powerful and present opposition. In today's talk and elsewhere in your work as well, you engage this tension between Ukraine's inheritance of Orthodox Byzantine forms and its engagement of Western European Reformation and Counter-Reformation developments as a working out of a kind of cultural distinctiveness, which eventually comes to underlie the signification of national difference. And while I think in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's something particularly important in this moment in delineating a Ukrainian distinctiveness, which is not assimilable into the great Russian narrative that you talk about. I wonder if that national frame, which engages images primarily as indices of identity, can sometimes tend towards making all images commensurate across style, precisely in their indexical capacity, and as a result, elide transformations which may occur in visual experiences, which attend to these shifts in style. And that seems especially important to me in discussing religious images, which are very much objects of use. They're carried and prayed and wept over by individual human bodies in lived spaces, in addition to also, of course, being objects which play into political or ecumenical considerations in Ukraine's sort of self-determining its orientation towards either the West, be it the papacy of the Mohyla era, or the EU of today, or the East in the Byzantine tradition, which in the current situation is increasingly being rhetorically subsumed into a kind of Russian neo-imperial impulse in a very troubling way, I think. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how you understand the relationship of these really monumental stylistic shifts and this very interesting recombination in the Ukrainian context of Byzantine or Kievan Rus elements with Latin or Western European ones. If you can talk about their relationship to historical changes in visual experience, which may or may not fall along these same lines of Byzantine East and European West. So what kinds of transformations are occurring in the ways that people see, and so perhaps also use these very stylistically different images? How are the subjectivities that are being formed by these images affected by transformations in style? Or stated otherwise, what kinds of shifts do the interpretive skills and strategies of the inhabitants of early modern Kyiv, which you talk about, have to undergo in order to countenance these transformations in visual style, which are being affected by really powerful figures like Mohyla. Second, Bohdan, I so appreciate your attention to the specificity and importance of terminology. So thank you for that. You touched on today and in the longer essay that you shared with us as well, the sort of common and incorrect conflation of Russian and Soviet culture, both of which often subsume Ukrainian culture in scholarship and in broader public consciousness. And I wonder if you can speak to how you see this terminology and its associated memory politics playing out in the contemporary, in scholarship and in current political discourse in the context of the war. We heard Alisa talk about a shift in contemporary art away from responding to the Soviet legacy towards something else. So this is perhaps a question not only for Bohdan, but I think we, at least in the diaspora, we skew towards seeing the Soviet legacy everywhere. And so I'm wondering how you, as somebody who has given a lot of thought to this terminological tension, how you see it playing out in the present. And then finally, Alisa, there's an undercurrent throughout your talk of the Maidan, or in the first wave you describe of the square of the October Revolution, as the stage for many of these art actions. And I think that your talk reads in a way as a kind of history of that space, as much as an overview of the artists that inhabit it. So I wonder if you can first speak to the significance of the public square for public performance art. How does it function? What does it enable or authorize? And then second, in some of the later artists that you discuss, we have this movement of some artists into museum spaces. And I'm curious to hear what you think changes, if anything, in that movement. What is lost or perhaps gained in that translation from the immediacy and urgency of the public stage or the ad hoc gallery of the open air square into the institutionalized art space? And does one's engagement with these political art actions change with that shift in space or place? So I'll leave it there and pass the baton to Yulia.
Can I add something? Is it possible for all of us to hold that many questions in our mind? So it might actually be wiser if we now give the word in the order the questions were received, first to Olenka, then to Bogdan, and then to Alisa, and then Lilia, it will be your turn. I just think that it will be saturated with questions.
Yes, and I think that's a good idea. And maybe Lydia, you answer to one, and then maybe the answer comes immediately after the question, and then you can turn to the second speaker if this is possible in your presentation. I don't know.
Okay, so I'll begin. Is that okay? Daria, thank you for putting so much thought into my presentation to begin with, and I really appreciate it. And of course, everything what you're picking up on is very true. I would like to say that I feel that the study of Ukrainian visual culture, especially Ukrainian or visual culture on Ukrainian territory, as it might be, is still in its very empirical stage. So it's very hard to answer certain questions because the monuments haven't really been studied. They haven't even been photographed or recorded fully. So every time you take on a monument, I think you're discovering something new. So one of the things I would say is, I don't think there was such a sudden shift. So partially, I think that the development of, for example, Gothic architecture in certain parts of Ukraine, or elements of Gothic architecture, infiltrated Byzantine architecture gradually in the connections with Poland. So I think the way we conceive of Rus needs to be changed. So, for example, we tend to think of Rus, with borders and as a state, and attribute it to Byzantium and Orthodoxy. But in fact, there were many Rus principalities, and each Rus principality had different neighbors and interacted with different neighbors. So in certain Western principalities, you already had this tradition of Gothic elements or entering into this architecture or visual culture. And I think one of the things, Mohyla, before he came to Kyiv, spent a lot of time in Lviv and the western parts of Ukraine. So this culture was not something that he thought he was building something new. I mean, I'm not in his mind. I'm projecting my I don't know, impersonation of Mohyla. Every time I study a figure, I feel like I'm embodying them in some way. But so I feel like he saw, it wasn't, it was something he saw around him, and he saw it, for example, in the chapel in Lublin. This is where the Commonwealth was formed, right? The Treaty of Lublin, that formed the Commonwealth, was there. And he saw his fatherland as the Commonwealth, right? So he saw his fatherland as the Commonwealth. His identity was of the nobility in the Commonwealth. And he also knew that he was Orthodox, and that an orthodoxy had been repressed, right? So I think he was trying to conceive of a church in the context of the Commonwealth, and saw all of this as part of his inheritance. I do think that there is a change in the way imagery is being read. And I think this has to do with Baroque culture and the whole, if you just think of emblems and the way emblems function and the way texts are associated with emblems. So I think you need to look at both literature and imagery and how the images and literature interact. And this has to do with the publications that, Mohyla patronizes, with the poetry of the period that gives you these lines of poetry with just an emblematic image from which you're supposed to interpret. So I think that there's, among the elite, already this change in the way images are viewed, or maybe I wouldn't say change, but an additional element to the viewing culture. The problem is that we, of course, only know what the elite has left us. So I can't tell you what the person who worships icon or venerates icons rather, would think about these images. I can tell you what the elite would, the way they would approach icons. But I do think that what we see is this new Jesuit learning spreading throughout Ukraine that impacts the viewing culture. And I thought I was very lucky to find that quote from the Cossacks who, want to tear down this church and see the rib vaulting as being unorthodox. I think that is, I'm never going to find more than that in a lot of the primary sources. So you begin to see some distinctiveness. I think the period that I'm talking about, the late 16th century, early 17th century, there's a general shift in notions of identity. So I think that the identity of a nation is seen as the identity of the nobility. And I think what you see by the end of Mohyla's time is the notion of identity becomes much broader among the Cossacks. It becomes more of what we think of as a national identity, an identity of the people. So there's also a shift as to who forms the nation. And the noble nation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, could be of any religion and from any part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I think Bistra said, I can't remember her exact words, but I really like the way she summed something up about what it is, what I find fascinating about Ukraine is exactly what we find fascinating about any other place in the world, right? And that is this constant negotiation and constant discourses and dialogues that often surprise you, right, as to what is happening. I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm going to stop at that so that others can speak.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the question, Daria. I will try and be as concise as possible because, of course, it raises so many important and really interesting questions. As far as terminology is concerned, I suppose a helpful place to start is what is the most common approach, as it were, to understanding this period of the 1920s and the 1930s, which is, as I mentioned, this notion of the executed Renaissance. This notion was articulated and developed in the 1950s by emigre scholars in the United States, and those scholars who also, in a way, were affected by Soviet repressions. And so we need to take that context, as it were, on board. And on the one hand, like I said, this notion of the executed Renaissance is bitterly truthful, because it does convey the tragedy of what happened in the 1920s and especially in the 1930s to Ukrainian modernists. It does convey the very real act of execution that happened at that time. It is not even a metaphor in this way. But at the same time, if we try to approach it seeking for elements that would really try and explain to us what was actually happening during that time and what is really distinct about this art, then perhaps the executed Renaissance metaphor isn't that exhaustive, I could say. And another element of it is that Yuri Lavrinenko, which is the emigre scholar who was the editor of the volume called The Executed Renaissance, also established some kind of a canon, which was part of this anthology that he prepared of the modernist authors. So just to give you a bit of an idea what an important thing he did, some of the works that he included into this volume, they hadn't even been published. They were handwritten, or some of them, there wasn't even any access to them anymore because the books were just destroyed by the Soviets. So that anthology was of critical importance at the time when it came out in the 1950s. At the same time, it somewhat simplifies the very metaphor of the executed Renaissance, and the canon established by Yuri Lavrinenko indeed simplifies the complex processes, overlapping processes that were happening in the 1920s and 30s. Among the main caveats that we should make about this notion would be, in the first place, that among all of the authors whom Yuri Lavrinenko includes in the volume, there is not a single woman author. That, of course, does not rhyme with the reality and doesn't pay tribute to all of the female artists during that time. And that is why I mentioned that the question of the study of Ukrainian modernism is also to a great part this question of discovery, and in particular discovery of women's art and women's literature. And it is a very important part of research, and actually in my mind it is a gateway into Ukrainian modernism from the perspective of general global modernist studies, which is what I mentioned earlier in terms of Ukrainian modernism sorely missing from this broader landscape of the study of modernism. Another problem with the notion of the executed Renaissance is this idea of well, Renaissance, of course, which is a questionable notion in itself, even though in this particular case we can, as I try to show, refer back to the Baroque tradition. So in that sense, in the minds of the modernist figures during this time, it was a Renaissance of a sort. But then there is, of course, this also emphasis on the sense of victimhood and on the clear delineation, as it were, between the Ukrainian and the Soviet. And of course, as much as the Soviet heritage is such a difficult beast to deal with, as it were, these days, especially during the war times, it is also really important to be aware of the complex processes of overlapping relationship between, on the one hand, Ukrainization and on the other hand, Sovietization that was happening at the same time. The notion that I propose for the specific period of the long 1920s, which is roughly between 1917 and let's say 1933, would be the notion of Ukrainian Soviet modernism. So not Soviet Ukrainian modernism, which is the usual grammatic way to refer to it, but rather this notion of modernism that on the one hand, inevitably was part of the nascent Soviet project to which Ukrainian artists definitely contributed. But at the same time, this perception from the point of view of the artists and the cultural figures themselves, that Ukraine wasn't really at the margins of this big project of this cultural development, but rather was at the center of its own. So that as far as this period is concerned. And just the final note in this respect, that of course, these aspects of Ukrainian modernism is a central part, we could say, a major part, definitely, but not all that there is to the story of Ukrainian modernism. In the classic study by Solomia Pavlichko, the range of modernism reaches back to the fin de siècle modernism at the end of the 19th century and all the way up to the 1960s and 70s, where it was especially developed beyond Ukraine, because of course within Soviet Ukraine, there was no opportunity anymore to develop this modernism. And by the way, the reason this time frame is extended until many more decades later, after the 1920s and 30s, only confirms and reminds us about the importance and the unfinished project of modernism in the Ukrainian case. So of course, we know about this metaphor and this concept of modernism or modernity in any case as an unfinished project in itself. But in the Ukrainian case, this notion of unfinished modernism acquires a totally different additional meaning, which is that this aspiration, this aesthetic aspiration, cultural aspiration to develop this art, this urgency of innovation was abruptly stopped, annihilated, and that is why this tradition, so modernism, Ukrainian modernism itself relies on this long-standing tradition of the Kyivan art, as we have seen in the case with Mikhailo Boychuk, who was, by the way, one of the first artists to refer back to this tradition, which is really important, and to rely on the new historiography by the Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky. And so this, on the one hand, being steeped in this tradition back to the Kievan Rus times and to the Baroque tradition, but at the same time, also the tradition that the artists in the 1990s and 2000s and nowadays, they perceive this time of 1920s and 30s as a matrix and tradition for themselves as well. So in that sense, it is also what we see now is the development, and I wouldn't say completion, but definitely a progress of this tradition happening before our eyes.
Thank you very much.
So now it's probably my turn. So yeah, thank you, Daria, so much for your wonderful questions. And first of all, I wanted to make a remark regarding the Soviet legacy. Of course, there are only so many ways how we can speak about Ukrainian art of the 3 decades in the 20 minutes. So I didn't have an opportunity to speak about the whole range of projects, because this actually the relations with of contemporary Ukrainian art with Soviet legacy are much more complicated than it might have seemed from my speech, because for the first generation which emerged during and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, this escape from this overly ideological landscape of the late, and especially of this shallow slogans of the which were already like absolutely not relevant to the people of the late Soviet Union, was a very important process. So they their apolitical, even sometimes position. I didn't mention here like the painters. There was a huge school of trans-avant-garde painting. Sometimes their apolitical position was the sign of the how to say the desire to break up with this Soviet ideological space. There were a lot of artists who were exploring the newly emerging national identity, and then after 2004, and especially after 2010, there was a huge interest towards Soviet modernism, especially Soviet modernism of 1960s, because in 1960s, Ukrainian artists, in spite of this ideological pressures, due to this relatively better climate in the cultural field, were able to rediscover both Boychuk and other modernists, and created a huge school of late Soviet modernism, rethinking and revising this early modernist artworks. And for the artists who worked after 2010, it becomes particularly relevant and important, especially after the so-called decommunization started in Ukraine in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. It was especially important because the artistic community faced the question: what should we do with all these monuments, all these mosaics, all these artworks that that our government suddenly wanted just to I don't know, to get rid of them. Now, of course, there comes a time to revise even the criticism of decommunization in the artistic community back then in 2015, because now we are looking at all this situation with a completely new eye, because we understand the wider picture of all this influence of communist narratives, and even the interest towards Soviet problematics in Eastern European art of after 2010 and 14. So regarding the significance of the Maidan of independence, you know, it's a very complicated question. I used it mainly as more like a poetic metaphor, because I needed something to link all three parts of my speech. And of course, like this Maidan becomes the main hero. And it's like, it's more about symbolical geography, because indeed for the last 3 decades, this Maidan of independence, the central square of Kyiv, becomes particularly significant. I don't know why, but whenever something bad or good happens, people just go there and either protest or celebrate. And this is like, and even artists, like if we're speaking about the new Ukrainian art after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so there was this very powerful squatting movement, like when artists were creating independent squats in abandoned buildings, and all those squats were situated on the radial streets near Maidan. So I don't know why. It's like, it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to it, to be honest. Maybe there is something special in that place. So if we speak about the movement to the museum, it's also an extremely interesting question, because it poses the question, from which museum and to which museum? Because when we are speaking about the end of the Soviet era, we are speaking about the escape from the Soviet institutional space and from the system of Soviet art, which was a completely different from what we see now. And of course, by the time of like 1991, it was already in decay, and artists wanted some new spaces, and they wanted to conquer new media, new options, new territories, physically and symbolically as well. So after that, we have to keep it in mind that no real museum of contemporary art emerged in Ukraine in the years of independence. So what the museums that we have now are either those classical museums that we have still since like a 19th century, and that which collections of which basically stopped after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or these are private small institutions such as, for instance, a Museum of Contemporary Art in Odessa, which is not a gigantic institution in the Western understanding of the word. So the artists were basically not moving to the museum. They were looking for a museum to move to, but not always finding where to move. For many artists, this lack of institutions was a very big issue. That's why for generations of Ukrainian artists, like for instance, Western institutions become the the space where they can exhibit and where they receive, where they can understand what they're doing more. Because in Ukraine, the new system of art institution emerged probably in late, maybe after 2006-7, when Pinchuk Art Center, Mistetsky Arsenal, big art museums changed a little bit their policy, and some new institutions emerged and new galleries emerged. But up till now, we are facing the situation where there is no such thing as a museum of contemporary art in Ukraine. So there is a huge gap in the museum collections, and Ukrainian contemporary art still exists as this apocryph, which has sometimes no material evidence due to the circumstances of the development of contemporary art in Ukraine in the last several decades. But as I discovered, for instance, during a recent seminar with our colleagues from Lithuania, this lack of museification is not only a Ukrainian problem. It's like a general disease of many post-Soviet spaces, which definitely deserves to be studied as a separate research. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So should I just present my question for Olenka and then she'll answer? Okay. First of all, thank you all for very thought-provoking talks that span across centuries, revealing the wealth and beauty and complexity of Ukrainian art. For the sake of time, I will jump right into my question. So Olenka, in some of your other works, you discuss how imperially supported 19th century Slavophile and Pan-Slavic movements, quote unquote, rediscovered Kievan Rus churches and cathedrals and used them to propagate the idea of the all-Russian Orthodox style. Russian imperial scholars and artists studied, restored, and reconstructed some of those sites, like the St. Sophia Cathedral and St. Cyril's Church, by taking into account solely its medieval appearance and completely ignoring all later 17th century Ukrainian additions and changes. So can you tell us a bit more about the 19th century and the subsequent communist 20th century history of the Church of the Savior of the Verstova Hill? And towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that there was practically nothing, and the church was, as far as I understood, kind of recognized only as the mid-12th century burial site of the Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, the founder of Moscow. But that seems to be an important site for the Russian imperial, from the Russian imperial perspective. So why then was this church ignored, and was it? And also, can you speak a bit about the significance of this church to today's Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Thank you.
Okay, so my first answer isn't going to be very nice or polite to anyone, but anyone who is Ukrainian should know this church. It is that important, and very few people know this church. And these questions that you're asking me prove exactly my point, right? This is one of the few medieval monuments to survive in Ukraine. We only have like a handful of these monuments. So basically, I would say that any Ukrainian child who goes to school, especially in the city of Kyiv, should know this monument and its history. But very few people know this monument and this history. Secondly, this church has been closed for a very long time because of the fight between the Moscow Patriarchate and the museums and the Kyiv Patriarchate, right? So it has become an embattled site. So part of dealing with the embattlement has been the constant restoration of this church by the Lavra Museum. Okay, it has now been restored with the help of Italians, and I have not seen the restoration, but the restoration still focused on the Kievan Rus period because it has been so ingrained in Ukrainian history through the 19th century and through the Soviet period that everything that is Kievan Rus is great, and we need to look at everything from Kievan Rus, which, don't get me wrong, that's my area of expertise. So I have nothing against Kievan Rus, but the point is that this structure is not important to Ukrainian history because of what survives in it from the Kyiv and Rus period, but because of what survives in it from the early modern period. So, yet, no publication exists on the frescoes that I've shown you. Now, there are people in the Lavra who have published a sort of general history and photographs of this church. The photographs that you'll find in Soviet publications are the discovery of a single 12th century fresco, which required the removal of the early modern images to expose it. And then during the Soviet period, that awful looking sarcophagus thing was put in there to mark the grave of Yuri Dolgoruki. And I don't actually know that anyone has ever found Yuri Dolgoruki, but if you know anything about archaeological practices and Soviet archaeological practices, whoever they dug up in that church would have been identified as Yuri Dolgoruki, right? So the point is, the church is important in the Middle Ages. It is important because it was a princely church on the outskirts of Kyiv. It didn't really survive. One wall was standing. So I know I messed up with the slides, but you could see the outline of the Byzantine structure and then the structure that Mohyla rebuilt. So the Byzantine structure, only the foundations, or I should say the Rus structure, only the foundations survive, right? And then you have the renovation of this church. I think Mohyla, one of the reasons he renovated this church is because he was also the ihumen or the arch, whatever it is, I can't remember, the head of the Lavra monastery, the archimandrite of the Lavra monastery. And this is right by the Lavra, right? It's 2 steps from the Ekonomichny Vorota into the Lavra. And I think the reason why these images have been ignored is because they talk about an independent patriarchate in Kyiv, and Mohyla as someone who was in fact had an identity of Sarmatianism and Ruthenian identity in the context of Ukrainian lands, and who was negotiating or willing to negotiate with the papacy about the union of the church. So if you know anything more about Mohyla, he is also the author of the first statement of faith in the Orthodox Church, right? And he is a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. So I think there are certain aspects of Mohyla that needed to be repressed. So basically, I think this, in a way, the question you've asked touches exactly why this series is important, because even Ukrainians, most Ukrainians, don't know the importance of this church, right? Have never been in this church. And it is one of 3 or 4 medieval churches in Kyiv. I don't know if I've answered the question again, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. Should I proceed?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
And in the meantime,
Yes, you can proceed, but maybe it's interesting also to remark that Lilia, you come near Kiev, right? You sent from there, right? Or
I left Kyiv when I was 2.
okay, good. So you couldn't see it. Good. Thank you.
Sorry, it wouldn't have been anyone's fault because the church has been closed for
this is clear. This is clear. I only wanted to make the point that you make a strong point. So your answer is so, and the question was so important also, kind of ask from someone born in Kiev.
Right. Yeah. So thank you so much. So my questions to Bohdan, I would actually would like to return to this lack of female artists and return to your own question that you pose in one of your notes in the longer essay. that you've written on the subject. So why do you think this uneven representation of the Ukrainian modernism as a solely kind of male space happened in the first place? And in particularly, it seems strange given the importance of such Ukrainian modernist writers as Lesya Olenka and Olga Koblyanska. And so on a different note, you discussed a great variety of artists, directors, and writers working at the same time in different media. But could you also talk a bit about the importance of the artistic group to Ukrainian modernism? Were groups and artistic collectives as common in the Ukrainian modernism as they were elsewhere? And along the same lines, you started your talk with the painting by Vasil Tsidlar, but can you speak about actual relationships between Ukrainian visual artists, writers, and directors? Were these artists responding to each other's work? And most importantly, how? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lilia, for this very helpful and great questions rather. In terms of the presence of female artists and cultural figures more generally in the 1920s and 30s, this is a truly fascinating issue, because whenever we look at the photos from the time and at the photos of the groups of writers that were established at that time, because of course, especially, well, it was quite popular during that time more generally, but especially in the Soviet Union, this sense of belonging to a group. So when you look to all the different groups that represented different kinds of aspects of art and culture, be it more towards peasant culture or more towards more elite, highbrow culture, as it were. When you look at these photos, you can hardly see any women there, even in the photos left from that time. And so I was always really intrigued and puzzled by why is it the case. And there is definitely more research needs to be done on that. And if there is anyone in our audience who is wondering which topic to choose to do research on in terms of Ukrainian arts and Ukrainian arts of the modernist period, I would really invite you to choose this one. From my understanding, one of the reasons why that was the case is because, of course, the Soviet system was a fundamentally patriarchal system. There was a difference between what was declared and what was happening in the actual reality. So, of course, prima facie on page, lip service was paid to the equality of men and women, to the emancipation of women. But at the same time, in practice, that was far from the actual reality. And in fact, when we look, for example, specifically at literature, for instance, in that case, there was a special genre, as it were, women's writing. So women were kind of liberated, but only to a certain extent and only within very limited confines. And those confines were regarding women writing about women's topics, whatever they were, in the perception of the actors of the literary process, as it were. And those topics mostly had to do with some sentimentality related to family, for example, or children. So those really classic patriarchal, as it were, shibboleths and classic patriarchal restrictions for women. And so they were pushed into this very narrow direction. But at the same time, I should say that even within that direction, there was quite a lot of subversion happening and quite a lot of really fascinating kind of writing happening as well. And I should also say that just a few years ago, actually a couple of years ago, the very first anthology of women's writing from the 1920s was published. So this is such a totally fresh, undiscovered topic. And it's as far as I know, so far it's only in Ukrainian, but I really hope it's going to be translated into other languages as well. But so even within those works and this anthology, it is in the first place extremely interesting to see how this feminist sentiment and feminist urgency makes its way into these writings as well. And interestingly enough as well, there is this sense of tradition too. So Lydia, you mentioned earlier about this really shocking and jarring contrast between indeed these really powerful female figures who not were just really important to the development of Ukrainian modernism. They were the pioneering modernist writers. Indeed, Lesya Ukrainka and Olenka Kobylanska, they were the mothers of modernism in the Ukrainian case. And interestingly, in the 1920s, there was even an attempt to publish an almanac of women's writing, which was specifically dedicated to Olga Kobylanska. So even by women's artists, there was this sense of continuity from that tradition. Another aspect of why we know so little about these amazing women's artists and writers from the time has to do actually with the canon that I partially referred to earlier, established by Lavrinenko, and also with this difference between, shall we say, nationally aware writing and proletarian writing. So in general, even nowadays in scholarship on this period, there is this, how should I put it, reservations or caution about broaching specifically writing which could be in one way or another called proletarian, that is written by authors who were not necessarily propagating really or trying or cultivating really highbrow literature, but were exercising a different kind of writing. And so that's one of the reasons why those writers who were really aware of this elite function of literature, let's say Mykola Khvelyovy, especially Mykola Zarov, they are much, much better known than other writers who were more, who by some scholars are perceived as these proletarian writers, whatever that means. Of course, we should make some reservations about this notion too. So I think this social element, the element of social background, has got a very important role to play. And in general, I think there is there is a much greater need in discovering female voices in general in Ukrainian literature. I feel like there is such a great, and I know that there is such a great treasury of those voices that really waits and screams to be discovered. And I think it's reflective of the bigger problem as well. And that's of course part of the more global problem of how few modernist female voices behind the general canon are known, and the question of canon. Because of course the modernist canon, apart from Virginia Woolf and a couple of other female names, is overwhelmingly male-centered and male-orientated, which doesn't reflect the actual reality of the period and of this artistic movement. And I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to try and give very quick answers to the other two questions. As far as artistic groups are concerned, definitely, like I mentioned, it was almost a fashion, as it were, during the Soviet times to form these groups, for these groups to try and support different ideas, and for these ideas to almost be in conflict between the different groups. And very sadly, this literary competition, this cultural competition, very quickly turned into political, blatant political rivalry, whereby there would be some organizations that would be much more loyal to the regime, and that the regime would support more, and they would start writing not as much critical articles about those authors who wouldn't agree necessarily with this nascent socialist realist canon. So this preference was given to these more loyal groups, and these articles would no longer be critical in this sense of literary criticism. They would be more like pieces that would then be used by the courts than to deliver this verdicts of execution towards these writers. As far as these groups are concerned, I mentioned already the Portuguese artists, and by the way, I should say that within the Portuguese group, there were many women artists as well, who, by the way, when we read memoirs from that time, it also becomes very clear from what a poor background they were coming, or underprivileged background, and even within their families, they were really discouraged from pursuing it. They were more encouraged to do some activities that are related to traditional women's jobs and something around art, but not art per se. So even by their own families, they weren't encouraged. But even when they were trying to join, actually, for example, this Portuguese group, there wasn't necessarily this immediate, as it were, enthusiasm to just accept them as equals. So they really needed to fight their way through even within those groups. And there was a great number of other movements and directions in terms of avant-garde, cubists, futurist art as well. So in this sense, Ukrainian modernism, even though it was really accelerated and condensed because of this short-lived period where the artists actually had a relative, at least, freedom to experiment and create this innovative art, all sorts of isms were pursued and experimented with by Ukrainian artists. And in that sense, even though Ukrainian modernism is definitely very distinct in its hybridity, it also was to a large extent on a par and in parallel and in synchronicity with the general tendencies and movements within the more general European modern landscape. And that is why it is all the more shocking that Ukrainian modernist art is not included into this bigger discussion of global modernism. Yeah, I think that I'm going to leave it there because we are running out of time and I want to leave more time for my colleagues as well. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you so much. I'll be very brief. Alisa, again, returning back to the question of Maidan. So some critics and artists, including Sergei Loznitsa, who was here at our previous event, described the Maidan revolution as a total work of art. So would you agree with this statement? And if so, how would you describe the relationship between actions done by individual artists or artistic groups and Maidan's artistic totality? And my second question, off of Daria's questions about these artists' entrance to galleries, and probably based on your answer, lack of museification, as you put it very nicely, how did this very strange combination affected these artists' careers? And what is, and if there is an artistic response to the war by the artists you were talking about? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a very interesting question about the total work of art, because I want to remind those who are not aware of it that this total installation is a term that was invented by late Soviet artist, unofficial artist Ilya Kabakov, who got extremely popular after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now is one of, and was born, by the way, in Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk as it was previously called in Ukraine, but in the age of 16 left Ukraine to study in the art school in Moscow. So this total installation has like roots. And yes, indeed, when we had this protests on Maidan, a lot of people mentioned that it looked like an art installation. And yeah, of course, we were like, we were using this word total installation because it really looked like some artistic environment created not only for the purpose of politics, but also, or protest, but also for some aesthetic weird reasons, because the ice barricades, these pop-up art installations, like which had political background, like for instance this Christmas tree, which was called Yolka, which became this huge installation in the center of Maidan and one of the centers of the protests and aesthetics of these barricades. Of course, when you enter that space, especially taking in consideration that all people were using, and it's very interesting how time flows in this how to say, altered states of political consciousness, because it's a completely different space where there's completely different logic and completely different behavior takes place. For instance, people are using carnivalesque dresses. They were like, and it was very interesting to analyze how they were using different dresses. For instance, people of older generations were adhering to this old Cossack aesthetics, which go back to Repin. I even wrote an article how Repin's artwork, Ilya Repin's artwork, Cossacks are writing a letter to Turkish Sultan, influenced accidentally even the protests on Maidan, because we saw just like, I was mind blown, because it's just like as if they came from that painting. So, but the younger generation, for instance, was using the steampunk aesthetics, computer game aesthetics, like a completely different situation. So yeah, when you entered that space, you had the feeling that it was some weird carnivalesque atmosphere. And recently there was one more return of total installation into my at least word. It's not that I'm thinking about total installations all the time, but in Kharkiv, in the first weeks of this war, a group of artists was hiding in the basement of this Yermilov Center, which is one of the main galleries in Kharkiv, and because it's in the basement of the University of Kazarin in Kharkiv, it seemed like a very safe location. And for 2 weeks, people lived there, had some strange like life, but by weird irony of life, this was the place which was bombed the most in Kharkiv, because it's in the center of the city. And after people evacuated from this Yermilov Center, the artists created this pop-up archive of their experiences and called this in the text. The curator said that this was not life. This was just art. This is the documentation of artistic performance, and this is just total installation. For me, I felt this completely different approach to the idea of total installation, because which was something that was totally aesthetical in Maidan and in 2014. This reference to total installation became the idea of escapism, the idea to escape the pressure of this political moment and to try to dissociate, you know, this psychological mechanism of dissociation. This is not with me, this is not me, it's something else. But I was recently warned by the editor-in-chief of a magazine, Texte zur Kunst, German, very good magazine, who told me that I have to be very careful using this idea of total installation and applying it to reality, because apparently a lot of right-wing, how to say it, ideologists and writers also are using it in order to somehow devalue what is happening in the country, and just to pretend to aestheticize the violence and this over aesthetization and over like too close connections between like violence and idea of total installation can be dangerous. I am not fully how to say it, convinced, but I'm just warning you that such an opinion exists in this universe. So regarding the museums and how this whole situation functions, there are a lot of collections, there are a lot of private collections, there are a lot of small institutional collections. Some artists were donating artworks to certain collections. Especially, there was this very important trend in the last 5 years when artists became, like famous artists themselves became either directors or curators of big Ukrainian museums. For instance, my late friend Alexander Roitbert, whom I already mentioned today, who died last year from corona, was a director of Odessa Fine Art Museum, and with his efforts, this absolutely backwards and conservative art institution suddenly became one of the most prominent and dynamic Ukrainian museums. And due to his personal connection with all the artists, he was able to do something that our Ukrainian state wasn't able to do for decades, to actually bring the artworks to the museum, just like some some artists gave it for free. Sometimes he would find some small honorarium to thank them, and so on. And just before the war, another important initiative of this kind appeared because another artist, Mykola Babak, created, surprisingly, without even telling anyone, in 1 year he created a collection of, I think, more than 250 artworks, and it's still growing. And he made it for the Cherkasy Museum. Can you believe it? So the museum in Cherkasy today will have the best collection of contemporary art ever, just because of this effort of one particular person who approached each person and said, you have to give this artwork to the museum, because otherwise there will be no history. It will be just all oral, legends. And we are now facing the situation when we are sometimes having troubles creating, like when I make exhibitions dedicated to 1990s and late 1980s, there are so many works that I know from, there are even sometimes photographs, but I have no idea where those works are. And it's a huge tragedy and badly needs to be changed. And there are a lot of initiatives in Ukraine that call for the creation, at least of some kind of a museum collection. But there are plenty of very interesting questions. What kind of collection should it be in the 21st century, in the situation when a lot of actual artworks are already gone? So it's an interesting topic, especially said in the current context, because we understand that a lot of artworks can be destroyed, and the destruction of cultural monuments, artworks, collections, and museums in this current war is one of the most important topics, because it's extremely important now to evacuate collections. A lot of museums have done it, but a lot of museums did not do anything, and a lot of artworks are already now situated on the territories which are temporarily, hopefully, occupied by the Russian troops. And these are huge problems. And some museums were bombed, as Arkhip Kuinji Museum in Mariupol. So today the topic of a museum is even more sad than it used to be before this war. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to ask you, so the speakers maybe also to respond to each other talks, or maybe you have questions, one to the other. And I also like to maybe at the end also to come to kind of questions what we can do. What first of all, I mean, what you all very beautifully have shown, that the tendency to write in broad strokes, or so to present art in broad strokes, so to speak, also in the museum, is always in danger to become complicit with an oppressive power, political power. And so how could we represent this very much nuanced and historically informed context that seems to be so needed to see the cultural difference, and also to evaluate underrepresented art. So this is one question. So maybe you can also respond to each other first. But I want also there's this question that many of you have also kind of touched on, is the question of reconstruction. And I spoke also with a colleague from the School of Architecture. I was saying, well, we have to think about reconstruction more than building new buildings, but kind of how to to integrate the whole ecological discourse into the new new challenges we have. What could we? What is there to be done? What is should archives be? So how should archives be protected, built? So how could we appreciate and also kind of show solidarity with the Ukrainian culture from our side? So maybe you can first of all respond to each other's paper if maybe you have questions. So you never have spoken to each other, but I think there was so you were very much in sync with the general message, and maybe this is the first invitation. And the second is that we maybe brainstorm about the possibilities what can be done and how can also institutions like ours help in this respect. So don't know who wants to respond to which paper, but I think it was it worked so well together. Olenka, maybe.
I would like to thank both of my co-speakers for their papers, and I didn't know Bohdan was working on the visual arts, so it's wonderful to see his work extend in that direction. I think there is a lot to be done on Ukrainian modernism, but I would also like to say, of all the periods of Ukrainian art, Ukrainian modernism has actually received more attention than any other period of Ukrainian art. And I think partially that is also because a lot of the individuals that Bohdan mentioned, so not Buychuk, of course, but people like Malevich and Tatlin have been ascribed to Russian modernism, which has received quite a lot of attention. So I think there's a huge discourse there that needs to be had. And I think it's a great topic, as Bohdan said, because of the way there are overlaps with Soviet identity, with modernist identity, with national identities. So a very rich topic, and many works that are unknown. And I would like to thank Elisa for her paper, because I think contemporary Ukrainian art and everything from the 1990s is so incredibly exciting, and there's so much of it. And again, I think one of the things that Elisa is pointing out is, again, there's a lot of empirical work that needs to be done, right? So I was just jotting down some names of artists I didn't know. So I think that period to me is fascinating, of the way the carnivalesque period and the way it ties in with literature. For example, like as you were speaking, I kept thinking of Andruchovich over and over again. When you talk about the carnival and carnivalesque. So thank you both. I've learned a lot. I would like to thank everyone who's worked on organizing this panel, because I think that is the answer to your question. I think one of the things that we can do is organize more and more of such panels that bring together different speakers who work on art, on museums, on the connection between literature and art in Ukraine. I think that is one of the things we can do. I think it's hard to answer about what we can do for museums in Ukraine. I've been thinking about that and talking to people in various institutions. We could try to help to send some packing material, but again, no one can control the Russian missiles, right? So what we need to do is end this war. That is, and I think that is also part of the problem with dealing with Ukrainian culture, is that there has always been, in these past 30 years, some kind of extreme situation that would always get the funding first, or have to be dealt with before cultural institutions. What I'm hoping is that this war will bring attention to what can be learned from Ukraine, and maybe then people in the West will invest more in these studies. And as I said, and as Bisra highlighted, decolonization. I myself teach in an introduction to Russian culture class in Cambridge, which I will never teach in again, because I have been presenting Kyiv and Rus materials under an introduction to Russian culture class that goes on through the Soviet period. And in the Soviet period, even when they talk about artists from Kharkiv or Kyiv, they don't even acknowledge the existence of a Ukrainian socialist state. Decolonization. I don't know why we don't have it in East Slavic studies, and everyone else has already moved way ahead of us.
Thank you very much. Bohdan? Do you want to, Bohdan, do you want to respond to the two speakers, and maybe also have some suggestions how, so what can be done? So very much also in a pragmatic sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Nicola, for giving us a chance to reflect on this very urgent questions, in fact. There are many thoughts that I have. I'm going to try and summarize them as concisely as I can. On the one hand, I'm going to start with your second question, actually, in terms of the practical actions that could be undertaken. So I could totally subscribe to what Olenka has just said, that a really important way to preserve this cultural heritage is to end the war, and a really important way to end the war is just this realization that there is this need for, even though that doesn't sound necessarily so related with culture, but there is real need in Ukraine for very practical military help these days. And those things, in fact, are interrelated, because I think that the attack, the 500 kilogram or perhaps 1,000 kilogram bomb dropped on the Mariupol drama theater is just the absolute epitome of the hell that is happening and the stance that is taken towards Ukrainian cultural heritage. That is the absolute symbol that really encapsulates the what is at stake, the danger, and what needs to happen. There needs to be a way for the Ukrainian army to protect these places, to fight back. And so if there is, if our audience could support the Ukrainian army in this way, or push for military support from the countries that you're from, I think that that's an extremely, extremely important thing to happen. And even though it is not necessarily the most, cultural thing to mention, but culture really depends on this. Another thing, very practical, is that I've been a part of this group organized by the German Association of Art Historians. And what they do is that they have these weekly sessions with museums in Ukraine. And really, museums in Ukraine are the institutions, and the people there are the people who know the best what needs to happen. And it starts with very, very practical issues, like some museums just not even having boxes where to put the boxes of the right kind to put the artworks in. Then the question of restoration as well, in terms of paints and many, many other questions related to it. The question of transportation, because there are certain works of art that are, for example, really, they have very big size, and there needs to be a very specific kind of transport that can transport that. And then there is this additional question that some museums decide not to evacuate their pieces of art. So what can be done if they're not taken out of these places? How could that be helped? And of course, there are so many museums all over Ukraine where, for instance, people do not necessarily speak foreign languages, and it is really important to reach out to these places and to see what museums really need this help, because not necessarily those museums that can speak about it are the only ones that really need this help. Oftentimes it's actually the other way around. Those who cannot speak about it need that help the most. Apart from that, there have hardly been any exhibitions on Ukrainian modernism. For example, as an example, Olenka is definitely right that out of all these periods, art periods, modernist periods has arguably been best researched, but that best researched is still very, very badly under-researched, which gives you an idea about how well the other topics are researched. And so what I mean by that is we really need exhibitions in London, we really need exhibitions in New York, we really need exhibitions in Paris, where Ukrainian artworks are included not just as a couple of pieces among the Russian avant-garde, as it were, where Ukrainian artworks, like it was, for example, in London at the Royal Exhibition dedicated to the centenary of the 1917 revolution, where artists like Dovzhenko and like Kazimir Malevich and Kliment Trechko were all included into this broad undifferentiated umbrella of the Russian avant-garde. So there needs to be Ukrainian art deserves and should have its own voice, so that there would be this understanding that this art exists and what kind of art it is. And perhaps this is a bit too much of a statement to make, but I think that if the topics that we have spoken about would have been known better, and if there would have been already exhibitions for decades of this art, this war would have had much less chance of happening. I'm deeply convinced of that, because at the moment, even in those countries, for example, in Germany, where I'm based, those people who support Ukraine in this war, they still oftentimes, for instance, are surprised to learn that the Ukrainian language is not a separate language, that they thought that it's a dialect of Russian. So, you know, for example, me reading an article on COVID doesn't make me a doctor. I do not have the background that I need, even though I can read a cleverly written article on BBC. So, of course, creating this background, or not creating, but rather creating the platforms for discovering this background is extremely crucial to understand the bigger context. And this is the final probably point I will make in this respect, which is the point that I started with, that it's extremely important to emphasize that, well, Ukraine makes the headlines whenever some kind of crisis happen. Whether when it was the Euromaidan or the annexation of Crimea, or the start of the war back in 2014, or now this unspeakable war happening right now and taking people's lives right now. Ukrainian war, our event has shown today, and that is why I'm so grateful to the organizers of this event, is that Ukrainian history and culture and art needs to be dated back to 901 rather than 1991. You know, when Ukraine gained independence, and the 901 is obviously a metaphor. It can go even earlier than that, given the emergence of the Kievan Rus. So that would be the main ideas that I would have in terms of what could be done, both on really practical things that urgently need to happen, urgent, real practical help, and in terms of the conceptual and sustainable and strategic development of Ukrainian studies and of inclusion of these or those topics into the broader discussions, be it of medieval times, of the discussions of Kievan Rus, or the modernist period, or the contemporary art. They really need to be included into those broader discussions. And just as the very final thing, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to my co-speakers tonight. I have certainly learned a lot, and I'm especially very grateful for very detailed discussion. I must confess, I haven't been to the church that Olenka has spoken about in such amazing detail, and I just really look forward to the time where it will be possible to come back to Ukraine, and I really pray for that church to still be there, to go there. And I'm very grateful to Alisa, not just for the talk tonight, but also for Alisa's research that I have been really grateful for in terms of the contemporary art that is being created during this war. Alisa has published widely on it, and I've been reading enthusiastically all these pieces, and I have certainly learned a lot about this whole process of the development of Ukrainian art in the 90s. So I have words of gratitude for that.
Thank you very much, Bohdan. Alisa is last.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. Actually, I also wanted to thank everybody who organized this seminar today, and of course my co-speakers. Regarding the church, which is one of the main heroes today. So I, for many years, I was a deputy director of Lavra Gallery, which is just next door to this church. And then I was a deputy director of Mistysky Arsenal and curator there for many years. And so half of my life basically was rotating around this place. And I must first of all say that for many years, this church was just closed. There was not so much, you know, that you could do, because it was like some endless renovation from God knows what to God knows what. I don't even know if they finished that renovation and what they were doing there, because it was just like, I was trying to get there for many years. So I know visually how it looks from outside, but I must confess I've never been there as well. And it's a shame. Maybe as a kid, I don't remember. I have some vague memories. But other than that, yeah, thank you very much, Olenka. It was really mind-blowing and so interesting to connect those three stages of the development of the Ukrainian art. And yeah, I also want to really thank Bohdan for his amazing ideas and all his especially for this work about Mezhigirya, which for me, and taking in consideration my personal history with Mezhigirya, was like, I even made a screenshot, because to be honest, I didn't know this particular artwork, and it's like, you know, it calls for some even article about the role of Mezhigirya in our lives. And to speak about what can be done, I think that Bohdan already said a lot. Yes, exhibitions are extremely important. I know that one exhibition of modernism is in the making, so there will be something. And I personally made several large-scale museum exhibitions in Europe of contemporary Ukrainian art, and I know how important it is when people see it firsthand and when they discover that it's like, wow, that's such a vast traditions, but it should be done on the more regular basis. And yes, of course, the main problem is, like, you know, one of the articles that I recently wrote was called "We Are Only Seen When We Die." So this is our main problem, that we only are in this focus of international attention when something horrible starts happening. And if we speak about some, you know, more how to say it, more smooth strategy and more productive one, we should pay more attention to all those things all the time. And Ukraine should be studied. Ukraine should be, like, Ukrainian art should be exhibited, and it should receive more attention, because even when we speak about books, there is a huge lack of books about Ukraine, especially in the United States. Like, there are some things that are published by universities, small publishing houses, cost zillions of money, but it doesn't become like this wide phenomenon for wider public. And it's a pity, because there are a lot of writers and a lot of artists who really deserve attention. And I see one question which provoked my imagination in our Q&A section. It says, I'm interested in learning more about how peasant students and revolutionaries living in the late 1800s in the areas that's now modern Ukraine, so their identity as distinct from related to Russian identity and culture. Can you point me to poetry, literature, visual art, or other art that offers insight into this subject? My answer will be very simple. There is one figure in Ukrainian history which is both like, how to say it, both sometimes receives too much attention, and at the same time receiving this much of attention sometimes is still so relevant and always resurrects during crisis times and during conflicts and during troubles in Ukraine. This person is Taras Shevchenko, both painter, very good master of drawings, and also a famous Ukrainian poet, and also an author of a diary. to be honest, after being exhausted by this doom scrolling and not being able to focus on anything else in this life for first several weeks of this war, I started rereading Taras Shevchenko's diary, and it was an amazing experience, because there you can see the roots of all the conflicts and all the problematics that we are dealing with today. All this, first of all, Taras Shevchenko was literally a slave, because he was a serf, and later he was became like this outstanding artist and outstanding writer. And then the empire was so rough on him and so like cruel that for a rather innocent crime against this empire, he was sent to be a military soldier for 10 years and suffered somewhere in the steppes of Kazakhstan, with all my respect to Kazakhstan, but that place was particularly unpleasant. So yeah, so, and you can, if you read this diary, you can see this identity. And if you read the poetry of Taras Shevchenko, you can see that this person understands himself as something separate, in spite of the fact that he comes from this very how to say it, simple peasant family, that he used to be a serf, but he has this very, very strong and distinctive identity. And if we speak about artworks, it's a very long story, but one of the artists whom I first thought about was Mykola Pimonenko. It was an artist who worked in the late 19th century, and he uses a lot of images of Ukrainian peasants in national costumes. He works with this identity issues, and it's very interesting to take a look at his works to see that, yeah, there was something different in Ukraine, and yeah, and all other, like, you can even read the hybrid, as Yulia Ilchuk from Stanford wrote a book about Mykola Khohol as a hybrid phenomenon of the imperial Russia and Ukraine. And yeah, even in his works you can find out a lot about Ukraine and Ukrainian identity, in spite of the fact that they're written in Russian. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Bisera.
Thank you all. I think we are drawing to a close, and by strange coincidence, at Stanford is visiting Denise Ferreira da Silva, who is a scholar of contemporary Brazilian art with a very strong decolonial aspect to her approach to images, performance, and installation. And I'll be happy to share with you access to one of her articles that is exactly on the topic we're talking about. It's a critique of Marxism as an intellectual platform. It's a critique of Badiou and Zizek, and basically saying what is escaping that approach is the question about race, slavery, capital. And when you bring race and slavery, what happens? So it is basically opens the field for new work that needs to be done, new work that exposes the structure of oppression. So be it Russian imperialism or the Soviet period or the post-Soviet period, there is a combined, in a sense, that the two sides of the equation, one that one cannot escape these structures of power, but one can expose them. That is as important as, in a sense, building the historical development of Ukrainian identity. I think the two go together, oppression and identity, and I think both need to be addressed. So I found that in the course of our webinar today, there was a lot of harmony and fluidity in the exchange of ideas. I think also our structure became very liquid, and I hope, in a sense, this continues in the future. I know that Olenka Pevny is organizing another webinar that will be on April 21st. And we hope, in a sense, that both the conversation will continue and the possibility of answers of how we could help could continue as well. Thank you all. Thank you, Nicola. I'll also give you the word to close the seminar.
Yeah, maybe I forgot to thank Nicole Chardier, who was very important to helping today to make this webinar happening from Yale, and also Milad Gatman, who has generously supported this event. Yeah, I think this is a start. I think what we learned is that we do not know enough, you know. I thank you so much that you showed that historical nuanced context is so important to understand Ukrainian art. And I think, as Bisara was mentioning before, or was saying before, Ukraine could, in a certain way. So if we think of the concept of decolonization of East European studies, could be kind of a center point to start this process. Yes, so I thank you all a lot for also your willingness and in your enthusiasm, and I wish you all the best, your families, and we hope. So I hope and I pray so that this war will be over soon, and that no one will kind of get tired of the support, but that the support for the Ukraine will even rise and be strong enough to break kind of this terrible war that that has changed already global politics, that has changed history, and thank you so much.